There's a memory from my childhood I always thought was harmless, almost funny. Years later, one small detail resurfaced and made my stomach drop. What I remembered as innocent suddenly explained everything that went wrong after. I was 7 years old when Mr. Hendricks moved into the house at the end of Maple. For years, that memory existed in my mind as nothing more than a curious footnote to my childhood. A slightly odd but ultimately harmless story I'd tell at dinner party. We had this weird neighbor once, I'd say, and people would laugh at the peculiar details I'd share. It wasn't until I was 32 years old, sitting in my therapist's office talking about something completely unrelated, that one small detail surfaced from the depths of my memory like a body rising from dark water. And suddenly, nothing about that summer was funny anymore. The story I'd been telling for 25 years went like this. Mr. Hendricks was a peculiar man who wore the same tan cardigan every single day, even in the oppressive heat of that Illinois summer. He had a red balloon that he kept tied to his mailbox, replacing it every few days when it deflated or blew away. When kids in the neighborhood asked him why, he'd smile and say, "So I can always find my way home." We thought he was just a harmless eccentric. My best friend Sarah and I would ride our bikes past his house, daring each other to ring his doorbell. Sometimes he'd answer with cookies, sometimes he wouldn't answer at all. That was the story. Quirky neighbor, red balloon, childhood game. The end. But the detail I'd forgotten, the one that resurfaced decades later, changed everything. It was June 1998, and summer stretched before me like an endless promise. School had just let out, and the neighborhood was alive with the sound of children claiming the streets as their kingdom. Our suburban Illinois town was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where mothers called kids home for dinner by standing on porches and yelling names into the dusk. Maple Street was a dead-end road with 12 houses, and every single family had at least 2 kids. We were lords of our own small unit, riding bikes until our legs ached, playing kickball in the street, drinking from garden hoses when we got thirsty. The Hendricks house had been empty for 18 months before he moved in. It sat at the very end of the street, a beige ranch-style home with brown shutters and an overgrown lawn. When the moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning in June, every kid on the street found a reason to be outside. The man who emerged from a Toyota sedan was younger than our parents, maybe in his late 30s, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and round wire-rimmed glasses. He wore khaki pants and that tan cardigan despite the temperature already climbing into the 80s. The moving truck didn't carry much: a sofa, some box, a few pieces of furniture. We watched with the shameless curiosity of children who had nothing better to do. He moved efficiently, directing the movers with quiet precision, never once acknowledging our presence even though we were obviously staring. The red balloon appeared 2 days later. I was riding my bike past his house with Sarah when we saw it, a bright red helium balloon tied to his mailbox with a white string, bobbing in the breeze. It stood out like a drop of blood against the muted colors of the suburban landscape. "That's weird," Sarah said, stopping her bike. She had a way of stating the obvious that somehow made it sound profound. We stood there staring when the front door opened. Mr. Hendricks stepped out onto the porch, and we both froze like deer. He smiled at us, a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes behind those wire-rimmed glasses. "Hello there," he called out. "You must be from the neighborhood." Sarah, never shy, called back, "Why do you have a balloon on your mailbox?" He walked toward us, moving with unhurried deliberation, stopping a respectful distance away, close enough to converse, far enough not to seem threatening. "So I can always find my way home," he said, as if this were the most logical answer in the world. "But you live here," Sarah said, pointing at the obvious house right behind. "I do," he agreed, "but sometimes I get lost anyway." "Don't you ever feel lost, even when you're somewhere familiar?" It was the kind of statement that meant nothing to a 7-year-old but would echo in my mind for decades. Sarah asked, "What happens when it deflates?" "I put up a new one," he said simply. "I buy them in bulk from the party store. It's become a bit of a habit." "We should ask our parents," I said, because even at 7, I was the cautious one. "That's very smart," he said, nodding approvingly. "Tell you what, you girls go ask your parents, and if they say it's okay, come back and I'll have lemonade and cookies on the porch. Not inside, just on the porch. I'll even stay in the doorway so your parents can see me from the street." Looking back, I can see how calculated this was, how perfectly he understood the psychology of parental permission and childhood desire. He was offering transparency, visibility, all the things that would make anxious parents feel secure. My mother considered carefully when I asked. She dried her hands on a dish towel, looking out the kitchen window toward the end of the street. "All right," she said finally, "but stay on the porch where I can see, and come home in 30 minutes. "Claire," my mother called after me. I turned back. "If anything feels wrong, you leave immediately. Trust your instinct." I nodded, though I had no idea what wrong was supposed to feel like. True to his word, he'd set out a plastic pitcher of lemonade and a plate of Oreos on a small wicker table. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, just as he'd promised, never crossing that invisible boundary between appropriate and suspicious. For the next 30 minutes, we sat on that porch and asked him questions with the relentless curiosity of children. Where did he move from? Chicago. What did he do for work? He was a photographer, mostly freelance, which sounded impossibly glamorous to him. He showed us a magazine with his architectural photographs, stunning images of buildings that made even mundane structures look mythical and important. "These are amazing," Sarah breathed, flipping through the page. "Thank you," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "I spent years learning how to see buildings properly, how light and shadow can transform the ordinary into something extraordinary." He never invited us inside. Not once. If anything, he seemed to actively prevent. Once, when my bike chain came off and I asked if I could use his bath, he said, "Oh, I'm having some plumbing issue. Better to bike home quick. The excuse was so smooth, so practiced, that I accepted it without question. Other kids on the street started joining. Tommy Breslin with his perpetual grass stain. Melissa Chen with her collection of scrunch. The Rodriguez twins who finished each other's sentence. Mr. Hendrix's porch became a gathering place, and the red balloon became a landmark. Meet you at the balloon house, we'd say, as if it had always been there. Our parents seemed fine with Mr. Hendrix had made a point of introducing himself to every family on the street within his first 2 weeks. He was polite, proper, never overly familiar. He attended the neighborhood block party in July, bringing a perfectly cut watermelon and staying for exactly 1 hour before excusing himself with apologies about work deadline. He was the kind of neighbor who waved when you drove by, who brought in your garbage cans if you forgot them on trash day, who never made noise or caused trouble. The only person who seemed suspicious was Mrs. Patterson, his next-door neighbor. She was in her 70s, a widow who spent most of her time watching the street from behind her curtain. My mother called her the neighborhood watch, though not always kind. There's something off about that man, I heard Mrs. Patterson tell my mother once in late July. They were standing at the end of our driveway, and I was in the garage, supposedly cleaning my bike but actually eavesdropped. "Oh, Helen, he seems perfectly nice," my mother said in that diplomatic tone she used when she disagreed but didn't want to argue. "The children like him." "That's exactly what worries me," Mrs. Patterson said. "A man his age, no children of his own, spending so much time with other people's kids. It's not natural." "He's not spending time with them," my mother countered. "They ride their bikes to his house and he gives them cookies. He's never alone with any of them. He stays visible on the porch." "Honestly, Helen, I think it's kind of sweet. He's probably lonely." "Mark my words," Mrs. Patterson said dark. "Something isn't right there. I can feel it in my bones." But nobody took her suspicions seriously. Mrs. Patterson had feelings in her bones about everything. August arrived, hot and thick, the kind of Midwest heat that made the air shimmer and turned playgrounds into torture devices. Then came the day that I'd forgotten about for 25 years. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sun beating down merciless. Sarah and I decided to ride our bikes to the balloon house to see if Mr. Hendrix had anything cold to drink. When we arrived, he wasn't on the porch. The lemonade pitcher was there, sweating condensation, with 2 plastic cups beside it and a note that said, "Help yourself. Back in a few minutes." 8. We poured ourselves lemonade and sat on the step, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. The front door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see into the dim interior of his house. "Mr. Hendrix?" I called out. "No answer." Sarah walked to the screen door, cupping her hands around her eyes to see inside. "He's not in the living room," she reported. Then we heard it, a sound from inside the house, muffled and indistinct. Not quite a voice, not a voice. Something that made my 7-year-old skin prickle with unease I couldn't name. "Mr. Hendrix?" Sarah called louder. "We're here for lemonade." The sound stopped abruptly, as if someone had pressed a mute button. A moment later, he appeared from the back of the house, emerging into the living room. Through the screen door, I could see him clearly. He looked flustered, his hair disheveled, his cardigan hanging open over his white t-shirt. But what I noticed, what my 7-year-old brain registered and then immediately filed away, was that he was carrying a Polaroid camera, and he was quickly slipping a photograph into his cardigan pocket. "Girls," he said, his voice overly bright as he pushed open the screen door. "Sorry, I was in the darkroom. Lost track of time. Did you find the lemonade?" "Yeah," Sarah said, holding up her cup. "What's a darkroom?" "It's where I develop photographs," he explained, settling back into his usual spot in the doorway. His breathing was slightly elevated, like he'd been rushing or exerting himself. "The old-fashioned kind, not digital. It's a bit of a complicated process." "Can we see?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Oh, it's not very interesting," he said quickly. "Just a lot of trays and chemicals. Plus it needs to stay dark, which kind of defeats the purpose of showing it to anyone." We accepted this explanation without question and drank our lemonade, chatting about nothing important. When we finished, we rode home, and the incident vanished from my conscious memory, buried under layers of summer days and school years and life moving forward. A week later, school start. The bike rides became less frequent. By October, the visits had stopped altogether. Mr. Hendrix became just another adult in the neighborhood, someone we'd waved to but no longer sought out. That winter, something changed on Maple Street. Parents began whispering in clusters at bus stops. Then, in February, police cars appeared at the Hendrix house. 2 of them parked in the driveway for hours. The police left. 3 days later, Mr. Hendrix was gone. Not arrested, just gone. The red balloon disappeared. The house went dark. The for sale sign went up in March. "What happened to him?" I asked my mother. She exchanged a look with my father. "He moved," she said finally. "Sometimes people just move." Years later, in my 20s, I brought it up again. "Mom, whatever happened to that neighbor we had? The one with the balloon on the mailbox?" My mother's face did something complicated. "There were concerns," she said slowly. "Some of the parents became uncomfortable with the amount of attention he paid to the neighborhood children. But he was always nice," I protested. "He never did anything wrong." "No," my mother agreed. "Not that anyone knew of." But Mrs. Patterson raised some concerns, and it was suggested that perhaps he should find somewhere else to live. That was my understanding of the story for 25 years. An odd but harmless man, judged too harshly by paranoid parents. I told it that way dozens of times. At college party, at work function, once at my own wedding reception when someone mentioned strange neighbor. And then came the therapy session. I'd been seeing Dr. Reeves for 6 months, working through severe control issues stemming from childhood experiences I couldn't quite act. We'd been circling something, but I couldn't figure out what. "Let's try something," Dr. Reeves said during our session in April. "I want you to close your eyes and think back to the first time you remember feeling unsafe, even in a small way. I closed my eye. Instead of remembering something about my parents' argument, I saw Mr. Hendricks emerging from the back of his house, holding that Polaroid camera, slipping that photograph into his pocket. The image was so vivid it made my breath catch. My eyes snapped open. "Oh my God, what is it?" Dr. Reeves asked, leaning forward with concern. The whole story came tumbling out, but this time, I included the detail I'd forgot. The Polaroid camera, the photograph slipping into his pocket, the sound from inside the house. "And you said this was his dark room," Dr. Reeves said carefully. "Did you ever see it?" "No. He said we couldn't because it needed to stay dark. But he came out with a Polaroid camera." "Yes. Do you know how Polaroid cameras work?" "I did. Polaroids develop themselves instantly, in the light. They don't need a darkroom. The processing is built into the film itself." The lie was so obvious that I couldn't believe I'd never caught it before. "What do you think he was photographed?" Dr. Reeves asked gently. I felt my throat close. "I don't know, but I did have suspicion because I suddenly remembered other details. The way he'd always insisted we stay on the porch, visible from the street, not because he was being appropriate, but because he was being smart. The way he'd refused to let me use his bath. The way he'd ingratiated himself with every family, becoming so trusted that our parents stopped watching carefully. The way he'd never been inappropriate with because we weren't his target. We were his cover, his alibi, his proof of normalcy." "What do you think was making that sound?" Dr. Reeves asked. "The sound you heard from inside the house? A muffled sound. The kind of sound someone would make if they couldn't speak clearly. If they were gagged, or terrified, or too young to form words properly." "I need to find out what happened to him," I said. That night, I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I started research. His full name was Howard Hendricks. I found a news article from 2003. 5 years after he'd left our neighborhood. Howard Hendricks arrested in child pornography investigation. I read the article 3 times, hoping I'd misunderstood. Police had raided his home after a tip from an internet crimes task force. They'd found thousands of images on his computer. The darkroom in his basement wasn't for artistic photography. It was for developing pictures he couldn't take to a regular photo. Pictures of children. The article noted that police were trying to identify victims, that they believed he'd been operating for over a decade. He'd been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He'd served 12 before dying of a heart attack in 2019. I found a victims advocacy website set up by the FBI for the case. They were asking anyone who recognized scenarios to come forward. There was a phone number. I stared at that number for 2 days before I called. An agent named Martinez listened to my story with patient professional. "You were never photographed yourself?" "Yeah." "No, we never went inside his house." "But you heard something that day, and you saw him with a Polaroid camera." "Yeah, late August 1998. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ms. Brennan, we have several Polaroid photographs from that time period that were recovered from Hendricks's property. We've never been able to identify the children in them or determine where they were taken." My stomach turned over. "You think they were taken in that house? On my street?" "It's possible." The timeline matched. He moved in June 1998, left February 1999. "If you heard something that day, it means there's a victim we haven't found. Someone who's been carrying this alone." I gave Agent Martinez my contact information and the names of as many Maple Street families as I could remember. The FBI came to our old neighborhood 3 months later. They interviewed 23 families, showing people reference numbers for unidentified photographs, asking if anything jogged memories or raised concern. And then, in September, Agent Martinez called me. "We found her," he said. "The girl from that day. Her name was Rebecca Hoff, and she was 33 years old. She'd lived 4 houses down from Mr. Hendricks. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and her stepfather worked nights, which meant that for several hours each afternoon in summer 1998, 9-year-old Rebecca was often home alone. She'd never told anyone. Howard Hendricks had groomed her carefully, starting with friendly waves, progressing to conversation, eventually inviting her inside for cooking, but only when no one else was around, only when she was alone. He'd told her it was their special friendship, that she was mature for her age, that other children wouldn't understand. He'd taken dozens of Polaroids, keeping her in the basement where no windows could reveal what was happening. He'd never physically assaulted, which was perhaps why she'd buried the memories so deep. There was no violence to remember, no acute pain to mark the experience. When parents had started expressing concerns and police had talked to him, he told Rebecca that she could never tell anyone about their friendship or they'd both get in trouble. She'd believed him. She'd stayed silent for 27 years, carrying shame she didn't fully understand. Agent Martinez asked if I wanted to speak with Rebecca. I said yes, though my hands shook as I agreed. We met at a coffee shop in Chicago, neutral territory for both of us. She was tall, thin, with dark hair cut short and eyes that looked older than 33. We sat across from each other, 2 women connected by a red balloon and a summer that had damaged us in different ways. "I heard you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "That day with the Polaroid camera, I heard something from inside the house, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know you were there." Rebecca wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. "I heard you too," she said quietly. "You and Sarah, outside on the porch." I remember thinking how normal it sounded. Kids laughing, having lemonade, summer vacation, and I was in the basement, and I couldn't make noise because he'd told me we had to be quiet, that this was our secret game. I remember wanting to scream for you but being too scared. "I'm so sorry," I said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. "You were 7, Rebecca said, looking at me with surprising gentleness. "There was nothing you could have done. Even if you'd known, Even if you'd understood what was happening. You were a child. This wasn't your fault. But I feel like I should have known. Like I should have sensed something was wrong. That's what he was good at, Rebecca said. Making everything seem normal. Making us all complicit in our own way. You thought you were visiting a nice neighbor. I thought I was in a special friendship. Our parents thought they were being appropriately cautious. He manipulated all of it. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about the therapy she'd started after the FBI contact. The process of recovering memories that had been fragmented and suppressed for decades. She told me about the relief of finally understanding where her anxiety came from. Even as she grappled with the horror of what had happened, she told me she was angry at Howard Hendricks, at the systems that failed to protect her, at herself for not speaking up, though she knew intellectually that none of it was her fault. But she also told me she was grateful that someone had finally remembered, grateful that the FBI had found, grateful that she wasn't crazy, that her sense of violation had been real and valid and not something she'd imagined. The red balloon, she said as we were getting ready to leave. I used to see it from my bedroom window. For a long time after he left, I'd see red balloons at birthday parties or stores and feel sick and not know why. Now I know. Do you still feel sick? I asked. She considered this carefully. Sometimes. But now it's different. Now I understand why. And understanding is the first step to healing. I've thought a lot about that summer and what it meant. About how a predator hid in plain sight, using our childhood innocence as camouflage. About how he was so careful, so methodical, keeping us outside while committing crimes inside. About how the red balloon was like a dark joke, so I can always find my way home when really he was marking his territory, advertising his presence, hiding an obvious. I think about the Polaroid photograph slipping into his pocket. The police found that photograph in his collection, matched it to the date, to the basement in that house. It's evidence now, catalogued in a file somewhere, a permanent record of what he did. But for 25 years, it was just another forgotten detail in a childhood memory I'd sanitized into something harmless. That's the thing about memory. We shape our past to make it bearable. We smooth the rough edge, remove the details that don't fit the narrative we want to tell. I'd remembered Mr. Hendricks as eccentric, as a victim of suburban paranoia. I'd forgotten the moment that mattered. The sound, the camera, the photograph. My brain had protected me from understanding what I'd witnessed, storing it away until I was strong enough to process. But Rebecca didn't have that luck. She lived with the truth even when she couldn't consciously access it. It shaped her life, her relationships, her sense of safety in the world. And she did it alone, thinking no one else knew, that no one else could possibly understand. I still live in Illinois, though not in that suburb anymore. Sometimes I see red balloons at grocery stores, at birthday parties, tied to mailboxes for celebration. Each time, I think about Mr. Hendricks and Rebecca and that summer when everything changed but none of us knew it yet. I think about how many other children he hurt in the years before and after Maples. Mrs. Patterson died in 2004, 5 years before Howard Hendricks. I like to think she knew she was right about him, even if no one believed her at the time. My mother says she mentioned it in her final years. Said she'd always known something was wrong with that man. Sometimes the paranoid neighbors are just paying attention. I still see Dr. Reed. We talk about how that memory has changed things for me, how understanding that moment has helped me understand my anxiety, my control issues, my need to know where everyone is at all times. Witnessing evil, even without comprehending it, leaves its mark. Being used as an unwitting accomplice, even as a child, carries guilt that's hard to shake. But I also talk to Rebecca regularly now. We've formed an unlikely friendship, bonded by that shared summer and the very different ways it affected. She's stronger than I am. I think she survived something I only glimpsed. She's rebuilding her sense of self, rewriting the narrative of her childhood with the truth instead of the confusion she'd lived with for so long. Last summer, on the anniversary of the day I finally remembered, Rebecca sent me a gift. It arrived in a small box, carefully wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a photograph she'd taken, a red balloon, released into a bright blue sky, floating away until it was just a dot of color disappearing into the cloud. On the back, she'd written in careful script, "We found our way home." I keep that photograph on my desk now, next to pictures of my husband and my family. It reminds me that memory is powerful, that the things we forget can still hurt us. But that remembering, truly remembering, is the first step toward healing. It reminds me that childhood innocence isn't just lost. Sometimes it's stolen by people who know exactly what they're doing. And sometimes, decades later, we find the courage to take it back. The red balloon isn't funny anymore. It never was. But at least now I understand what it meant. A marker, a signal, a bright spot of color that said nothing to see here. Just a quirky name, the perfect camouflage. We both carry our red balloons now, Rebecca and I, but at least we don't carry them alone.